This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast, episode number 136. For most of the history of the web, content practitioners have managed their work in integrated content management systems like WordPress, Drupal, and Adobe Experience Manager. Many organizations are moving away from these monolithic products to headless CMSs that are part of an emerging modular ecosystem for building web experiences. Sam Bhagwat's new book, Modular, The Web's New Architecture, can help you understand and navigate this new way of working with content.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 136 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I am really happy today to welcome to the show Sam Bhagwat. Sam is the co-founder and the chief strategy officer at Gatsby, and which is it's not a static site generator. What do you call Gatsby, Sam?
I would call it a modern JavaScript framework for content sites.
For putting sites together. And your role there, you co-founded it, and you're now the chief strategy officer. What is, a couple of quick things. What led you to found Gatsby, and what does being a chief strategy officer there entail?
Yeah, so rewinding back a few years, in 2015, my best friend Kyle Matthews created an open source JavaScript framework to build websites based on React. And it started, this was really early in the React days, and it started taking off among developers that were kind of excited to build with this new framework. And Kyle was very early in that community, very much felt that React would be the future of web development. I started getting involved as Gatsby became more and more popular, and one day we kind of just turned to each other and said, let's make a company here. It seems like we should be doing this, and that's how Gatsby as a company got started. So these days, now fast forward 5, 6, 7 years, right? And it's pretty clear that React and modern JavaScript is going to play a huge role in web development. I think that's pretty broadly accepted. The Jamstack, the composable web, the modular web, it goes by a number of names, is getting just a ton of mainstream adoption. And so, right now at Gatsby, I mostly spend a lot of time with our customers and kind of prospective customers, helping people understand how to put all of these different pieces together.
Right. And one of the ways you've helped people put it together is with that book you wrote. You just wrote a book recently called Modular, The Web's New Architecture and How It's Changing Online Business. Did that book arise out of all that education you've been doing?
Pretty much. I mean, we were having a lot of conversations with folks who were getting into this world, and folks would come from a lot of different backgrounds. Some folks would come from the content world, some folks would come from e-commerce world, some folks would come from more of like a startup engineering world, and each group of folks understood certain things about the architecture, but also didn't understand certain things about the architecture. And so I wanted to kind of, after we had a lot of similar conversations, I wanted to kind of tie it all together with a little bit of kind of the history of how all these pieces came together, as well as sort of a practical guide of how to use the different pieces together.
Yeah. And I love there's a lot to like about the book, I'll just say. I really appreciated it and enjoyed it. But early in the book, you talk about the rise of the modular web, and you talk about all these things that we're all kind of aware of, but they've come together in a way that creates the need for modularity. Can you talk a little bit about some of the key inputs into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's almost like a, Fellowship of the Ring kind of moment here, where you just get a lot of different groups that coming together that are kind of aligned in a lot of different veins that so for example, the rise of kind of JavaScript on the web, especially the JavaScript ecosystem, the importance of web performance, the SEO update that Google did a year and a half ago, I think is maybe the best example of that. mobile especially, and the need for performance on mobile specifically. There's a lot of kind of design trends that have come along that have sort of taken a while to shake out with mobile, that are pretty important. The cloud and SaaS in general, right? The proliferation of all these kind of services for search and authentication, and of course headless CMSs, right? And just the proliferation of all these different services. So there's a number of different threads. I mean, and then kind of the e-commerce, the rise of gradual sort of steady rise of the e-commerce over, the last decade, being another piece. And so there are all these really different pieces of the puzzle that when you kind of put them all together have created, this environment where it's now possible to kind of assemble a system for running your website and your online presence from all of these different pieces, where that was much more difficult to do, 5 or 7 years ago.
Right. And all those things you mentioned, like just cloud and SaaS makes this, it provides an infrastructure for a lot of this stitching together. But it's also like, and JavaScript, it's so interesting to me because JavaScript was around for like 20 years before it really took off. Was it the React framework, do you think, that really, or I don't follow that world very closely?
Yeah, there were a couple things. So the 2000s were kind of a lost decade for JavaScript in a lot of ways. But sort of starting near the end of that decade, there was just kind of a bunch of different things that happened at the same time. There was like an open source kind of standards committee that kind of got their act together after a long time, and agreed on some sort of syntax improvements that really helped move the sort of like the developer experience forward. There were things like Node, so the server-side runtime, right, and NPM as a package management system that also originated around that time. And there's been a lot of things since React being, and Vue and similar kind of component-based frameworks that came around the middle of the decade that kind of accelerated that trend. But I'd say that, like, really the JavaScript sort of the movement and maturity of JavaScript started around the beginning of the 2010s.
Okay. And that, which is also the same time that like mobile is becoming a real issue to deal with. And if I recall correctly, that's around the time that headless CMSs kind of became a thing as well. Yeah. I wonder if there's a chicken and egg thing there. Did these things emerge because they were needed because of each other, or? Yeah.
You never really know, right? I mean, but you're right though. I mean, cloud and SaaS happened at that time. Like JavaScript started to get good, and mobile happened at the same time. And when you sort of have those, in some ways, those trends kind of just stack on top of each other in terms of driving momentum for this modular world that we're in now.
Yeah, and that's the point. Regardless of the exact sequence and in relationship between all those things, it's clear that there's a need for modular architecture for the modern web. And can you talk a little bit about like what that looks like? Like like a lot of my listeners, I think, are, come out of publishing and journalism and places that probably just have like a WordPress site or Drupal or maybe an enterprise site. And they may have seen like, a Jamstack site or something like that. But can you talk a little bit about that whole environment of like the modular web that you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely. So, and I think it's different for different kinds of sites. So it's going to look different for an e-commerce site. It's going to look different for a more content-driven site. It's going to look different for a news site. But I think there are some things that are fairly universal across different industries and use cases. I think the one of the terms and phrases that I use in the book is this idea of a solar system, which is, I was actually sort of talking with Contentful CMO at the time, just about sort of how this architecture was unfolding, and I'm over here as sort of, an engineer kind of turned founder, right? And, she's there as, experienced marketer, has been a marketer for 25 years. And we're just kind of like talking about this and how should we talk about it? And I'm like, well, it's like a federated architecture, you've got all these different things, all these different pieces of the puzzle that are kind of connected to each other. And I've start drawing with my hands in the air. And she's like, well, maybe it's like a solar system, right? You've got all these a few different planets, and then each of the planets has moons, right? And the moons orbit the planets, but the planets kind of are all independent sort of systems. And I think that's I put that analogy in the book, and I think that's a really good way to think about it, right? This solar system idea. In terms of how the architecture is constructed, you might have an e-commerce system. Let's say, and let's just say you're a Fortune 500 company or something, and you might have an e-commerce system that's powering a store, and you might have different types of review and discount and promotion and shipping and logistics types of systems that feed into your e-commerce. You might have your headless CMS, but then you might have other types of systems like internationalization systems that feed into that CMS. You might have your development framework, which is pretty closely related to the hosting platform that you'll be using. And then, so that might be like a Gatsby, right? And then like React, which is kind of your and your various sort of components as well, if you're using maybe, a storybook. And I'm throwing out a lot of these sort of like frameworks and technologies and tools. And, I think it's, but you can kind of see that like, well, that, the development tools might be one planet, and the e-commerce tools might be another planet, and the content tools might be another planet. And there might be integrations between these various things, but each of these different puzzles are kind of, in some ways, you have to figure them out one at a time, and then you kind of pull them all together to create your overall architecture and your overall technology setup.
Yeah, a few minutes ago, you used the word federated. I've also heard you talk in the past about the content mesh. And then I don't know if you use the term, but I think often of the role of orchestration, like of that solar system you just mentioned. Is that sort of what's your current thinking on that? Like how you orchestrate, how you pull all this together?
Yeah, I mean, the short version of the story is that there's a lot of different workflows that you'll want to think about. And I've given this is actually, so, this is one of the things I spend time sort of like talking about, because a lot of folks who are going into this role have the same question. And like, how do all these pieces work together? I kind of get what they are individually, but how do they work together? And so there's a lot of kind of these pairwise integrations that help the system hang together. So, just to give a couple of examples, often you'll want to feed your products in your e-commerce system into your CMS if you want to store like auxiliary information inside your CMS. And so, CMSs and e-commerce systems often have integrations with each other to enable that. You often want to be able to see the content as you're inside your CMS. You want to preview the content and what it looks like on the site before you kind of push it live. And so the hosting platform, we spent some time building this at Gatsby. Some hosting platforms have preview functionality that integrates with the CMS to provide that sort of experience and workflow for content users. And you can kind of go down the list, but there's often an integration between your component library, right, and your site, or your your e-commerce data also gets pulled into your site. And so we have these kind of sort of reference architecture diagrams, and I have a couple in the book of hey, here are all your different systems, and then here are sort of the integrations between your systems that are the most important ones that you'll want to be thinking about.
Yeah, I actually printed out, I'm in a co-working place, so I have access to a printer. I actually printed out your solar system pages because I wanted to have it handy as we were talking. And so that's, and I scotch taped it together. So that's one way you can orchestrate it. One thing is, as you were talking just now about like the way you stitch together like a CMS with your e-commerce system, or the ability to preview, there's sort of like different, each of those, like the preview function, that could be just like a fairly kind of like a simple small unit of functionality. I guess one of the things I've encountered or heard about in the modular systems is this kind of need for just rightness. Like what is how you could atomize everything and decouple everything and have these little tiny modules, or you could have a giant monolithic CMS. We're obviously somewhere in between those. What's the mechanism for just rightness for the?
Oh man, that's such a philosophical question, but a good one. Um, I think I think I've seen it kind of emerge over time a little bit. People just get a sense of how they want their systems to play together. Some of the integrations between CMSs and e-commerce vendors, for example, happened within the last couple of years as like the CMSs realized that was something that their customer base desired, right? We were pretty early on with preview again, like 2-3 years ago, but that's become kind of like more of a popular workflow as well. So I think over time people get a feel for it, right? But it's definitely not something that just kind of like gets born in. Sort of like the systems don't emerge fully fledged into the world with that just rightness.
Yep. No, and you're reminding me too that like it's a craft. Like most content people, I think, would associate themselves with some content craft, like writing or design, or engineering or strategy around their content practice. And so I see this that kind of emerging role of the orchestrator of this, which kind of gets me to like one of the real big things I wanted to ask you about, because you're out in this world so much, especially for content practitioners. What does the future hold? Like, will there be new jobs like content orchestrator or something like that? How do you see content roles unfolding in the future?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I think one of the things we see in terms of technical trends for the headless CMS world is that people are viewing sort of content in two ways. They're viewing it as data and they're viewing it as code, right? And they're viewing it as data in the sense of like there's a growing sense of, well, we need to make sure that our content sort of pairs well with our e-commerce system, because we might need to supplement our e-commerce system, or maybe our content models are related to our products in some way, and that sort of needs to be solidified, and that it needs to kind of be piped between the systems, right? And it's kind of data in that way, and it's structured. But the flip side is that it's also kind of code, and so the content world is starting to think about, well, how do you merge in content branches to each other, right? And how do we have like more fully fledged review processes? Is there maybe in 5 years we'll have some sort of Git like PR pull request and review system is going to become more prevalent. I think it's certainly possible. Right now, I don't think the technology is there, but I think that these kinds of workflows are likely to become more common over time, especially in kind of larger organizations.
Yeah, and that's really the way you just said that. It's different. Like you can roll back versions in Word or something like that, but what you're saying is much more something like Git, where you're actually there's like a system for managing versioning, but not just versioning, the other stuff you mentioned as well. Does that come out of like, I know that some technical documentation folks talk about docs as code and kind of document their work the same way they would, the same way they work with code. I guess it almost doesn't matter the origin of that, but the fact that you can think of content in the same way that you do code, that's really interesting.
Because at the end of the day, content and code are both words that are multiplayer collaborative, collaborative aspects. And, things have become development has become much more collaborative over time, right? If you look at, I don't know if do you read Joel Spolsky's blog posts at all?
I do. I have off and on. Yeah, but not lately.
Did you read his 12 his blog post of like the 12 things to have. So he wrote a blog post around 2000 or so, and he was like, you'll be really happy. When you're looking for a job as a developer, you should look for a job at a shop that has version control, right? Because it's really rare, but it's really important. You know, you don't want to just lose things, or like, and fast forward 20 years, or even if you fast forward 10, 15 or 2 years, but especially fast forward 20 years, gosh, it's like version control. It's like, of course you'd use version control. Why wouldn't you use version control? But that was something that we had to develop over the last couple of decades. And it's something that enables like easier collaboration, right? And I suspect a lot of those changes are also we've seen some of those changes in like the data science world. They came to the development world first. They came to the data science world after that. I suspect they're coming to the content world, and we already kind of see some of them in terms of some of the features that are coming out of various kinds of headless CMSs. So I'd say that like that's. But I think it just takes time for these, like, especially in a sort of post-COVID world, right, where it's not as easy as just gathering around somebody's desk and like all sort of like shouting out ideas together. You need a little bit more of a structured process in software to do some
and
of
I
these
think
things.
you're reminding me of this thing that's fairly common, like the way the smallest e-commerce site is held to the same standards that Amazon is. The way that anybody working with words, you think like, well, heck, I can collaborate in my Google Docs. Why can't I do that in my CMS?
Right,
And I know
exactly.
a few CMSs, like I know Sanity has collaborative authoring. Are there others that do that as well?
We haven't seen it as much. I mean, what was that? Gather Content, that sort of
Right.
we were so familiar with them. But I mean, I think that's a great example. I think the experience is going to move more towards, is it that sort of collaborative multiplayer authoring? Is it something more like Git? I don't have an opinion on exactly which way it breaks, but I think it'll break some way towards more multiplayer, more collaborative.
And I think my hunch is that in a modular world, the chance for advancing that kind of stuff is better than if you're tied to like somebody incorporating that as a feature of a monolith. If it's something that can be developed independently, there's better odds of it happening. Is that a reasonable hypothesis?
I 100% agree about that. So, that was, and I think what you were just saying was one of the really underappreciated aspects of the cloud in general, right? So I think about something like Algolia, right? It's really high quality search, and it's become a search primitive in many ways that like just gets used across WordPress, across Drupal, across e-commerce, across really just a ton of different things. But how did that happen? Well, it's because you could amortize the cost of that developing great search across the whole web, as opposed to like, there's only so many resources for great search in Drupal, or pick your CMS. But like, if you can use it across the whole web, then you can invest more resources in it. And I think, that's powerful, right?
Exactly.
That's powerful.
I don't know if it's the exact right concepts, but I'm thinking of like best in breed or separation of concerns. Those two are related, that you like, if you just focus on search, you can do it really well. And part of doing it well is doing it in a way that's modularizable, so that developers at WordPress and other places can grab it.
100% agree, and I think that the interesting and in some ways tricky aspect from sort of an architectural perspective is that we've spent the last decade or so unbundling the CMS and breaking it out into all its constituent pieces and creating these best of breed solutions. But I suspect we're going to spend the next decade rebundling the CMS, right, and getting all these integrations sort of really good and out of the box, and intuitive and even more intuitive to use over time than they currently are, because you replace the cost of you sort of add complexity costs. There is some complexity costs, and we need to reduce that complexity cost over time. That's something I think a lot of folks across the ecosystem are working on.
So a little bit of a pendulum swinging back and forth there. Yeah,
I think so.
That makes sense. Hey, one of the you mentioned in passing a couple of the benefits of modularizing things, like the need for speed arose from like the Google search algorithms favoring sites that perform better. Are there what else is pushing this? Are there factors that'll push for even more, modular solutions, or things like search, like you mentioned, Algolia, they really captured that part of the market. Are there other things do you see coming, especially of interest to maybe content people, in that family of optimizable things?
I think that's a good question. Just generally one of the big things driving this over time has been e-commerce, because more dollars over the internet just creates larger markets for a lot of this stuff. To your point about Google's SEO change, and performance for e-commerce sites is always a huge driver of everything they do. So I'm not, I don't have a crystal ball what the next big change is going to be. I see a lot of the small, the COVID was a huge kind of boost as well, in terms of, because again it was sort of like boosted the shift towards e-commerce. I don't know. I'll be interested to see when. What are your thoughts? Do you see anything over the horizon that you think is going to be?
I don't know. I see things that I hope will happen. Like we were talking before we went on the air a little bit about, like, some of the buzzwords floating around, like omnichannel strategy. Like,
Yeah,
a lot of people talk about that, but I don't see a huge amount of it actually, like real efforts to integrate content strategy efforts across an enterprise. There's, of course, the branding people talk to, the marketing people talk to, the product people talk to, but so omnichannel, I hope, is a thing. Personalization is another thing that people talk about a lot and is sort of in its nascency, but it doesn't seem to really, like, even the people who are doing it well, like Amazon, it's still laughable sometimes. Like, oh, you bought a couch, you must be a couch enthusiast. It's like, so I don't know, actually, just those two examples, because I think those are two that people talk about a lot. Do you see opportunities for modular architectures increasing the odds of implementing omnichannel strategies or personalization?
I think that's I like those examples. In some ways, I think the promise is that the things that the big technology companies, the Amazons, the Googles of the world, kind of take for granted, which is having the resources to be able to do that, with a quality that it provides a lift in whatever metrics they're looking for, right? A lot of these modular tools are kind of starting to provide that functionality for the rest of us. I think personalization is interesting in the sense of, like, we have had personalization tools, but I love Dean Barker's like blog post of, like, and I think he kind of captured the zeitgeist a few years ago. He's like, look, they're not all they're cracked up to be, right? Like, they're a lot more work than you thought, and maybe they're not as big of a reward as you thought. So I know it's a buzzword, but maybe just think twice before you bet whole hog on this trend. And I think he's right? But there's a chance that, like, that that changes over time as the technology gets better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, Sam, I can't believe it. We're already coming up close to time. These always go way too quick, and I could talk to you forever. And look forward to seeing you at Decoupled Days again next year. I hope we get to see each other again there. But hey, is there anything last before we wrap up that just come up in the conversation, or that you just want to make sure we talk about before we wrap up?
I think that I think one of the things that we're excited we're excited about for the next few years is so we spent one of kind of the things that sets sort of like Gatsby apart, and the thing that we spent a lot of time thinking about is the data layer, and kind of Gatsby has a data layer, and it integrates it basically lets you integrate a number of different CMSs or data sources and sort of treat them fairly similarly. And so for a while, like, we've had folks saying, well, this is the data layer is one of my favorite parts of Gatsby as opposed to other, frameworks. But we actually are thinking about, we actually just launched a product called Valhalla, which sort of lets people use this data integration, layer with any kind of framework or mobile app or anything. So, it's still early days, but we see a lot of like excitement around it, and I think that comes back to your point about orchestration, which is that the interesting things that we're likely to see over the next 2-3 years are not necessarily new point solutions, but they're like new integration and orchestration ways of pulling our existing pieces of the puzzle together.
Nice. And it does feel kind of like that right now. Like there's been a lot of like individual stuff done, like really good search stuff, really high performance ability to render pages and stuff. But now it's like, how can we really tease it together just right? I love that. And orchestration, I think that's the right word for it.
I think so too. It seems like a good word.
Yeah, good. And Valhalla sounds, I'm really intrigued by that. I almost want to, I think I'm going to try to build my next site in Gatsby just so I can play with that. And just build like 2 or 3 because the whole point of Valhalla, right, is that you can have like multiple CMSs sourcing your one website or other experience, right?
Multiple CMSs sourcing it, and then pull that data into maybe pull it into a Gatsby site, but also pull it into a mobile app, and do that, be able to like multi-channel.
That's a whole now you just reminded me, I'm going to have you back on to talk about just the whole world of product content and how anyhow. But hey, one very last thing, Sam, what's the best way for folks to stay in touch with you, to follow you online and connect?
Well, you can reach me on Twitter at CalcSam, and you can also, that's CALC like calculator and then Sam like my name. Or you can email me at sam@gatsbyjs.com as well.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sam. Really good talking with you.
Thanks for having me on, Larry, and it's great chatting.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.